Good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM. I will be your host for this evening, whatever that is, this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I'm here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. The views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU, UCIMC, or the Urbana Socialist Forum, or, as we like to say on the television version of this show, UPTV. So welcome back to our guest from last week. It was really cool of you to carve out 2 Monday nights to talk to us like this. I noticed you're wearing the same outfit, though. That's kind of weird. Do you always wear that when you go out, or just?
Well, I'm self-employed. I don't have a big clothing budget.
Yeah, oddly enough, I'm wearing the same. This is my uniform for. Anyway, welcome back. This is Jack Wilkie, a local attorney who is an expert in immigration law. We've been talking about immigration stuff last week. Where we left off, we were talking about DACA and DAPA and that sort of thing.
Lots of acronyms.
Yes, lots of acronyms. So I had a question last week, but a whole week has gone by and I've forgotten what it was. It was something about DACA. Anyway, I know one thing that I was thinking. The stuff you were telling me about the different times you come and how long you can stay and all this stuff, doesn't it strike you that that's all kind of arbitrary? Like the actual person involved, the immigrant person who's here, is just the same person. It's just a matter of circumstance whether they came initially on a certain kind of visa or not, whether they came and stayed the whole time or went back, all that stuff. I guess my point being is that, one of the things we talk about on this show a lot is how once you get to know a number of people who are immigrants, you start to realize that they're not really all that different from anybody else. They just right. happen to have been born somewhere else. And that this idea that there's something strange or alien or criminal about immigrants is really just completely made up in somebody's fevered imagination. And so all these various categories that you can get caught in. One thing let me finish my thought. The various categories you can get caught in are just based around circumstance. But it materially changes what you would have to do if you at some point decided, okay, I want to become a citizen. It's really easy for people to talk about, well, you should just follow the rules and do it the right way. But assuming that somehow you got off track with those rules for whatever reason, like let's say your sister lived here or your mother lived here, came down with cancer, you lived there, you're like, I've got to see my mother, and you come here and it turns out that she's actually going to kind of be okay, but she's going to need some help. So instead of just coming here for a few months to see her as she dies, suddenly it's like, well, she could live for several years, so I'm just going to stay with her, and I can't go back now because she depends on me. You know what I mean? There's a circumstance that's completely innocent. Nobody can say, oh, this person's coming here trying to get free goodies, right, sponge off the government. They came here for a personal reason that anybody would do, but they just happen to not be in sync with the government.
Yeah, well, that's true. And, there's a million stories in the naked city, and everybody's different. And, one thing I will tell you, I've been practicing law now for 26 years. I've only been practicing immigration law for 14 or 15. But in that time, there's a tiny fraction of my clients. They come here to work, so, for example, most of them are from Mexico and Guatemala. They work much harder than most U.S. citizens. A lot of them are working 2 jobs, and it's economics. But immigration law is a minefield. It's very complex, and it's hard for lawyers to keep up with a lot of the changes, and the rules are always changing also. Yeah. So, for example, and this is kind of what prompted me to get involved in immigration law, every once in a while, actually the last time this really happened was about 15 years ago, there is something, some would call it an amnesty, but what prompted me to get into immigration law was in the year 2000, just as Clinton was going out of office. It was basically an extension of an earlier law, but it's something called the Life Act, which enabled certain undocumented people who got a petition on file before May 1st of 2001, and if they could show they were in the U.S. in December of 2000, those people would be able to do what's known as adjusting status, which basically means pursuing the green card process here in the United States. Like somebody who'd entered on a visa, there's a $1,000 penalty, of course. There's money involved. But, you know, to most of these people, that's money that's well worth spending because they don't have to go through the trauma and the drama, as we discussed last week, of leaving the country and waiting 10 years outside the country, which is what most people who come in without a visa have to do. And that program prompted many, 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 many people to apply for green cards. There was a mad rush to get the filing done under the deadline. And up until that point, I had been referring every immigration case, even though I've been representing Spanish-speaking clients for 10 years in other areas of the law. I'd been referring the cases to another attorney here in town who has since left town. She's in San Diego now. But she, at that point, was about the only person in town doing immigration law. And I started thinking, why am I referring these cases away? But that's an example of how that change in the law is an example of how what is already a complex minefield area of the law can change. And so that program, which was good, you know, good for immigration lawyers, good for immigrants, was really great. And because it had already been extended once before, everybody thought, okay, well, we passed the May 1, 2001 deadline. Everybody thought it was going to be renewed again. And then 4 months after that, 9/11 occurred, and everything changed. Everything changed after that. I mean, when I started practicing law, I was dealing with the INS. Remember that? The Immigration and Naturalization Service, which was a division of the Department of Justice. After 9/11, we have a whole new cabinet office, the Department of Homeland Security. And it changed everything. You know, and I think, notwithstanding all the terrible things that are happening in Mexico, I think we pretty much know that the terrorism isn't coming from Mexico. The terrorists aren't coming across the southern border. You know, we don't have ISIS in, you know, Ciudad Juarez. We've got some bad violence. But notwithstanding that, the law has not changed. There have been some efforts, and, you know, it's kind of a political football. So, yes, I agree with you. People basically are the same. And that's one of the great things about this area of the law. It's one of the few areas of the law, I think, that can have a happy ending. You know, basically, as I explained last week, I do family-based as opposed to business-based immigration. And you're basically bringing families together. And, you know, I remember the first time where I got a waiver, and the wife was from Mexico, and she was allowed, she already had kids, she was allowed to stay here in the United States with her family, and now they bought a house, and, you know, you kind of grow up with your clients. That's a happy ending, but I have clients from Asia. I have a lot of clients from Africa, where I try to speak my bad French, you know. Voulez-vous parler avec moi? That's all I know, okay?
That's not going to get you far.
It's not. But, I mean, you realize that people are people, but you're dealing with a politically charged situation where particularly some of those states, Arizona, they look at things different from the rest of the country. So, yeah, I mean, it can seem unfair, but I think really it's a matter of tweaking the law to take into account the reality that there's 11 or 12 billion undocumented people who are part of the economy. We have to do something about that. Coupled with, you know, I think we have to give people an incentive to to come here legally. But as I mentioned last week, if we can increase some of the number of visas so that people aren't waiting 20 years to come into the country, I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah. Well, one thing we haven't really addressed, and this is something that I'm sure you will remember from the early days of the immigration forum that we were dealing with, was something like that. Anyway, I'm not sure how I can make this segue, but one of the things we have not addressed yet are all the different ways that one can become entangled with the law because they are undocumented. They do not have that status. And how those things build up over time until you end up having a criminal record, despite the fact that you're no more criminal than I am. It's just your circumstances are different. So if you, let's say, one thing that we used to talk about a lot was if you just have a tail light out and somebody stops you. Oh, you're driving without a license. Oh, well, then suddenly all these things start piling up.
Right. That's true.
And some of them can become very serious, right?
That's true. I do a lot of traffic court defense. So let's talk about the traffic court context. And again, let's talk about somebody from Mexico, because most of my clients are from Mexico. And this situation has been ameliorated slightly because, partially through the efforts of the Immigration Forum, we now have a law in Illinois that allows people who lack Social Security numbers to get Illinois driver's license. However, in the old days, prior to 2014, the situation would be like this. A guy from Mexico lives in Urbana and works at Solo Cup, or lives on the other side of Champaign, and he needs to get to work, or maybe he's got two jobs. He has to drive. It's illegal to drive without a license, but he can't get a license because he doesn't have a Social Security number. At this point, the law required a Social Security number to get a driver's license. He's got a family, he's got to work, so he drives. Okay? I think most of the police officers in this town are very good and they do their job. I've met a lot of them. We have some Spanish-speaking, some great police officers. But every once in a while you'll have somebody stopping somebody for maybe driving Mexican. But let's, putting aside any ulterior motives, let's say there's a taillight. You get a ticket for speeding or for a taillight, but you don't have a license. Okay, so what happens is you get a ticket for driving unlicensed, or even if you don't, if you just get a speeding ticket with no driver's license attached to it, what would happen would be you plead guilty in the court sends the record down to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State would then create a driver's license number for the sole purpose of suspending it. The law is you drive without a license, that's a basis for suspending your, quote, license, even though you never had one. So now you have a suspended license. So the next time you're driving across town, your taillight's out, you get a speeding ticket, you run the stop sign. Now you get a ticket for driving on a suspended license. This is no longer a petty offense. This is a Class A misdemeanor. That means you could get up to a year in jail. That typically means when you get a misdemeanor ticket, they don't just write you the ticket, they arrest you, they take you to jail. You have to post bond, if you can. If they allow you to post bond, which is a separate story, having to do with the secured communities. And what happens is this thing snowballs. Each time you get another driving while suspended license ticket, the penalties get increasingly severe. The third time, they're going to want some jail time. And these tickets in and of themselves are not going to be a grounds for deportation. They're not criminal offenses, but it's certainly a more severe scenario than somebody who had a valid license. And in the DUI context, not that we can condone DUIs for anybody, but under the law of Illinois, if you get a DUI and you don't have a valid license and or you don't have insurance, which a lot of my Latino clients lacked, then you're charged with a felony. Okay, it's a Class 4 felony. It's an aggravated DUI. And so they get a first-time DUI, and typically they're offered a month in jail because it's a felony, whereas Joe Blow, American citizen, gets a DUI, he may get his license revoked, but he's not going to have to worry about jail. So, yeah, they're, and it's not, I wouldn't call it prejudice, it's not unequal protection under the law, but that's the way the law is written, and it just so happens that those people who lack driver's licenses would, in fact, experience more severe penalties than those who had licenses.
Yeah, and they're, speaking of which, there are incentives along the way for someone to not pay their fine or to not show up for court or something like that because they're afraid or
That's
they
true.
don't have the money.
That's true.
So if I'm like 18, 19, and I'm driving and I'm young and not so smart about it, so maybe I'm speeding and I don't have a license. I see those lights behind me, I might take off and make them chase me because I think, oh God, I can't get caught, so
now
I have to get away.
fleeing and eluding. Now you have another misdemeanor.
So I mean, just being human, not being criminal aliens, but just being human beings. There are a lot of different ways that this stuff can really get out of hand very quickly.
Right.
If you're frightened or, I guess frightened would be the word. I was going to say.
Well, there is a lot of fear, and so again, let's go back to Mexico. I think there's a lot of fear of the police there because there's a lot of corruption there. There's violence, there's shakedowns, there's bribes, and I think a lot of people from Mexico, for example, might think that that's how the police are here with St. Cook County, but and they're not, they're not. But we did have one of my friends, Officer Brandon Thomas, who's on the Champaign Police Department. He's a school resource officer at Central, but he speaks Spanish, and I'll put in a plug for his chocolate business. Black and White Chocolates, makes some really good candy. But Officer Thomas offered some seminars at Shadowwood a few years ago where he spoke Spanish, and he explained basically, we're not out to get you, if you do get stopped, show us your driver's license, but yes, there's a real fear factor. A lot of these people think just showing up in the court, immigration's going to show up and and that's happened, but I would say that happens less than 0.1% of the time.
Yeah, but if you're living kind of under the radar, you don't know that.
No, you don't.
You wouldn't really have a way of you're living under the radar because whatever reason you're here, it's you're generally afraid all the time on some level.
Yeah.
Even if it's only afraid of being recognized or afraid of being in a situation where just a casual conversation where somebody's going to ask you a question that you don't want to answer. So there's this sort of just general level of concern and wanting to keep secrets. And I can totally imagine being called to court and going, there's no way I could do this. I can't do that. I don't speak English that well. I don't know what's going on. They're going to take me away. They're going to do all this stuff. So that's it. I can see how a lot of people have gotten into trouble and have a hard time getting out. Are there other ways, other than traffic stuff, that this kind of thing applies, that where similar situations occur?
Let's branch it out to the criminal context. And it used to be where a minor traffic infraction could, at least it felt like it was a crime. There's a program called Secured Communities in Champaign-Urbana, and as you know, the Immigration Forum and some other groups were instrumental in getting the sheriff to lift that policy. And I think you were probably involved with this before I got involved with the Immigration Forum. But what Secured Communities is or was a program under which if somebody got taken to the county jail, the normal process is they're entitled to post some bond to get out of jail while their case is pending. And for relatively minor traffic stuff, it might be $100 or $200 or $300. But under the Secured Communities Act, basically the county sheriff agreed to act as kind of a babysitter or a gatekeeper for immigration, and they would put a 48-hour hold on people who were in jail to basically let immigration know, this person doesn't have a social security number, we think he's undocumented, you know, we're not going to let the family post bond for 48 hours, come and get him. And that would happen. And, you know, we had some real horror stories where the mother's driving across town, she gets a ticket for driving without a license, she's got 3 little kids in the car, they take her into custody because she doesn't have a license, there's an immigration hold on her, she's never committed a crime, and she ends up in immigration's custody because she couldn't get out of jail.
Right.
And you know, we had a good discussion with the sheriff's office about 3 or 4 years ago maybe now, and Sheriff Walsh agreed that they're busy enough over there, they're not, and he's an attorney also, his interpretation of the law was that they, and the case law was that they were not going to participate in this program anymore. But yeah, I mean, that's an example of where a relatively minor thing could promote some fear. And, you know, it spills over into the civil context as well. So, for example, somebody gets hurt on the job. I do some workers' compensation. Let's say you're working in the pork plant where, you know, there's dangerous conditions. People are losing fingers all the time. A lot of people don't know they have rights if they get hurt on the job to, you know, the employer's supposed to pay your medical bills, they're supposed to pay you 2/3 of your average weekly wage while you're off, they're supposed to pay you some sort of compensation depending on how much you were earning and how bad the injury was. And just because you lack immigration status in the United States doesn't mean that you can't pursue a workers' comp claim. I mean, I've represented a lot of people on those, and they don't know that they're entitled to that. You know, so there's kind of a shadow world that shadows people in a lot of different facets of their lives.
Well, I guess what prompted the question was partly something that I dealt with some time ago. This was actually before the immigration forum. A friend approached me, you know, as one of those, well, you know how this stuff works, right? And I was like, well, I don't know, what is it? And basically the problem was that they were friends of theirs, were undocumented. They had a child in school, I think it was middle school, who was having emotional problems, you know, like acting out, and I think threatened suicide or something like that. So they got a letter from the school in English, which they understood enough of to get the gist of, and the way it was worded, I think it was some kind of just sort of boilerplate, kind of legalistic stuff that goes along with anything that comes from a school district, that made it sound like if you are unable to take care of this, child services is going to have to step in and remove the child from the home, whatever it was. Like, I think it was because it was a suicide threat, like somebody overheard the kid say, oh, I'm just going to kill myself. And so it was like, oh, this is serious stuff. You have to deal with it, you know. But anyway, they were like totally freaked out. They had no idea what to do. It's like, we're undocumented. We can't, they're going to take our kid away. We can't fight it. We can't do anything about this because we can't admit to them that we don't have X or whatever. And I mean, it was just this long, convoluted, and it really, all it took was for the person to get a copy of this thing so I could read it and say, oh, well, actually, it doesn't say that at all. All it says is you have to respond in X number of days to the school nurse or whatever and tell them that it's okay, or get your doctor to send them something saying that your kid is okay and everything's fine. You know, it didn't turn out to be anything, but they were terrified. Like, literally, they were starting to pack. That's how terrified they were, because they were going to move to a different town, give up their house. You know, I mean, it was like, that's how frightened they were of this situation, because they had no idea what it meant. And so I'm thinking there are probably lots of people out there in similar circumstances who just run into day-to-day stuff that most of us would just go, whatever, and brush aside. But they don't know that they can go whatever on that.
Right.
And so they're not doing things, or they are doing things they shouldn't do, or whatever, based on this fear that they walk around with. And that's neither here nor there. That's not a legal question, I guess. It's just
Well,
what
I think
this stuff makes me think of.
That's consistent with my experience. There's a lot of fear out there, and I think we all know that fear often comes from ignorance. And if you don't speak the language, it's one thing not just to speak the language, but knowing that you're undocumented, dealing with the paranoia all the time. Mm-hmm. Because, separation of families is probably the ultimate nightmare for any family. Oh, yeah. And it happens. Unfortunately, it happens. And for what it's worth, my understanding, and I'll sort of caveat all this, I don't do removal, as we immigration lawyers call it, which is deportation defense. Right. I don't go up to I can't be going up to the immigration court in Chicago. My practice doesn't allow it. So I usually refer people to attorneys up there that speak Spanish. But my understanding is that there is currently a policy called prosecutorial discretion where the government's not actively deporting people unless they have pretty serious criminal records or violence. So what often will happen is if they do get into the pipeline, they might be required to report once a year, but they're not actively being pushed out. But, it is a real fear that exists across the board, in the schools and employment, with the courts, all over the place.
Well, like everybody who has a job who's undocumented has a social security number of some sort, probably, unless they're working for Joe's, drywall company and it's just all like cash. Mm-hmm. So most of them probably don't actually have a social. It's somebody else's who's died, or they just made it up, or I don't know how they come up with these things.
Yeah,
but
buy it from a guy. Yeah.
There's this whole other level of legal complication based around that I'm sure some people like around tax time, or you get a lot of stuff from the government about IRS is changing the rules or whatever, and if you don't know what that thing says, it all looks pretty scary.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I've had, a lot of these people will just use a fictitious social security number, which is actually better than using something that belongs to somebody else, because in the latter context, I've had clients getting charged with possessing a fraudulent social security number. And, they can be earning earnings on somebody else's number, and that other person says, hey, I didn't earn this much last year. Where did all this stuff come from?
Oh, right.
It's a felony. So, there's layer upon layer of complications that can arise. There really is a value in at least being able to refer people to various providers in the area that can speak Spanish or their language, that can, here's the counselor you have to go to, here's the lawyer, or here's the doctor or dentist who can help you out.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you. There's so much more that we could have talked about, but we've run out of time again. Unbelievable. 2 weeks in a row we've run out of time.
These 2 weeks just seem to have flown by.
I know. I don't know what it's. I'm just getting older, I think, for me. Anyway, I really appreciate you showing up here. You have been listening, in case you weren't paying attention, to CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM. Our illustrious guest, Mr. Jack Wilkie, attorney at law, who was gracious enough to give his time to us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate it. I hope you'll tune in next week for some more scintillating conversation and interesting and informative stuff. Until then, we'll see you later. Bye-bye.